Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog's Radical Engagement series. And we start a new series on the work of Alvin W. Gouldner, Two Marxisms from 1980. Now, I'm going to start us off with a bit on Gouldner because he is a figure that's come up recently in his studies of the new class from a Marxist perspective and his studies of bureaucracy. Uh, some of his most famous work from the 1950s is on bureaucracy. In fact, his 1954 work, Patterns of Industrial Bureaucracy, is kind of classic. He taught sociology at Antioch College from 1952 to 1954. Then he was a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis from 1957 to 1967. He was also professor of sociology at University of Amsterdam, and from 1972 to 1976. He's famous for a couple of works. I'm talking about one of his later ones today, but his early work, Patterns of Industrial Bureaucracy, like I mentioned, was important for doing case studies and ethnological work in actual bureaucracy in the mid 20th century. He went and actually developed this more in a book called Anti-Minotaur, The Myth of Value-Free Sociology, where he claimed that sociology could never be objective. Any claim to be objective is largely false, and that Max Weber had never made the claim. In 1970, he was actually wrote his probably most famous work, which was The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology, which again picks up on this, and he developed themes that we have seen in people like Theodore Adorno's negative dialectics. So Gouldner is known as much for an internal critique of sociology, but also for his studies on developing bureaucracies, the quote new class, bureaucratic management, Taylorism, etc. His last two works, which are both posthumous, the two Marxisms, Contradictions and Anomalies in the Development of Theory, and Against Fragmentation, The Origins of Marxism and the Sociology of Intellectuals, are kind of important for Marxists. There was a study about Gouldner written, about 25 years ago. It came out when I was just graduating from high school. And it was called, what was it called? I think Alvin Gouldner. It's written by James Chris. Alvin Gouldner. Sociologist and outlaw Marxist. Okay, yeah. And if you want to learn more about like a summary of his thought, that's a good place to start. And I'll come back to some critical work of Gouldner later. There's a piece in the journal Fast Capitalism from issue 1.2, which I guess came out in 2005, by Charles Lemert, called Why Mills and Not Gouldner, that I might do on the Patreon for my audience for more context. Gouldner's come back into the spotlight recently, mostly because of his attempt to understand Marxism and sociology, which makes him kind of interesting in that regard. I remember he was cited in a piece in the New York Times in 2016 about why the highly educated are so liberal. So he's come up in popular culture, although not that much. Well, that's enough introduction. We are going to start with the introduction to his 1980 book, The Two Marxisms, Contradictions and Anomalies in the Development of Theory. And I think this is a really rich text. Obviously, like with most of these, we're not going to read all of it out loud. We can't. But I'm going to read large chunks of it. And I might do most of the introductions. So I hope you follow along as I kind of give commentary. Part 1, Contradictions within Marxism. Quote, with all philosophers, it is precisely the system which is perishable, and for simple reasons that it springs from an imperishable desire of the human mind, the desire to overcome all contradictions. Friedrich Engels. Alas, two souls dwell in the breast, and one seeks divorce from the other. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This struggle is a conflict defined not by the indifference of two sides and their distinction, but by their being bound together in one unity. I am not one of the fighters locked in a battle, but both, and I am the struggle itself. I am fire and water. Hegel. Introduction. And this is Gouldner. Having set out to change the world rather than to produce one more interpretation of it, Marxist theory must ultimately be weighted on the scales of history. It's a pretty challenging start, isn't it? Convention has it that on a blustery October day, in a muddy St. Petersburg, the military forces of the Bolshevik Party stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the provisional government that had replaced the Tsar months earlier, and took command of the state. Actually, the storming of the Winter Palace was a more confused affair, for many revolutionaries had been infiltrating the Great Palace all day through its hundreds of entrances and were already in sign when the final assault took place. Indeed, as that assault was but the culmination of a less dramatic military movement, for the Bolsheviks had, days earlier, already assumed control of most of the public buildings, the post office, the railroad station, the telegraph offices, and all the other vital centers of communications. In any event, on October 24th, 1917, old calendar style, November 6th, new style, the Bolshevik Party that Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had carefully pruned and steadfastly trained to his will for some 15 years came to power in Russia. There was indeed 10 days that shook the world, as John Reed described them. And there is little in the world, within and between nations, that has not felt the impact of that event. Now, remember, this is in 1980, and the Soviet Union hasn't fallen yet. In a way, that's our big impactful event. Although, while hardly a whimper, it didn't so much go out with a bang either. Back to Gouldner. Since that time, many other nations have also come under the governance of Marxist political parties, all of whom learned from, even if not modeling themselves on, the experience of the Bolsheviks. In addition to the vast Chinese nation, others have come under the reign of Marxist states are Afghanistan, asterisk, that's fallen apart, Albania, Angola, Bulgaria, Cambodia, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Ethiopia, Hungary, North Korea, Laos, Latvia, Lithuania, Mongolia, Poland, Romania, Vietnam, South Yemen, and Yugoslavia. And this is Varn interjecting, oh, what 40 years makes in difference. How many of those still would we call Marxist states? Definitely not Afghanistan. That's going to fall apart soon, actually, from the time this was written. Albania, gone by the 90s. Angola, not so much. Bulgaria, gone by the 90s. Cambodia, complicated question. Cuba, still around. Czechoslovakia, 90s. East Germany, no longer exists, 90s. Ethiopia, no longer Marxist. Hungary, 90s. North Korea, still around, although its relationship to Marxism and its Juche ideology is contentious. Laos, I think it's still technically Marxist. Latvia, 90s. Lithuania, 90s. Mongolia, 90s. Poland, 80s. Romania, 90s. Vietnam, still around. South Yemen, not so much. And Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. And I read that just to remind you how different the world was, even in my lifetime. I was alive when this book was released. Barely alive. I would think I was not even 1 year old yet, but I was alive. Readers will note whether this list has contracted or expanded. It's contracted significantly. At this time, about 1/3 of the world's population lives under the governments of states regarding themselves as Marxist, and this has all come about in little more than half a century. It's very interesting. This is Jordin thinking about it. It's very interesting how fast that seemed to retreat, because it seemed like the Great Expansion was actually between 1950 and 1978. And then the Great Contraction is the 80s into the 90s. And even the countries that remain communist did market liberalize for the most part. The exception being the DPRK, although it seems to have recently market liberalized some relations with Russia and China under Kim Jong-un, although the details of that are kind of sketchy and hard to find out. There have been economic liberalizations, although to not an extreme degree. There's not been anything like neoliberalism or anything like that in Cuba, but that happened starting in the aughts at the end of Fidel Castro's reign. And Castro was also more open to the rest of the world in many ways. Never in world history has there been more so profound a change in human lives and social systems among the many nations of peoples in such a brief time span. Again, remember when this is written. Never, for example, has military conqueror, religious prophet, or a new way of life spread themselves so far and wide that in what, from a historically informed point of view, must be regarded as a shorter possible time span in the events of such magnitude could have occurred. And let's remind ourselves, from 1948 to 1980, Marxist states seemed to be expanding, particularly in the 50s and 60s. And what can be seen as a real march towards victory in less than a generation. But now a generation from when the Soviet Union fell, as it fell now 31 years ago. And I do remember when it fell. I was 11 years old, 12 years old. We have seen in some ways one of the fastest growing changes the world has ever known, and then in some ways one of the quickest retreatments that happened. And it's so interesting that this book is written in 1978, 79, 80, right? Gouldner was to die in 80. So he did not see where this was all going to go. But going back and reading a book from 1980, Marxism does feel like a very different prospect than it does now. It's something to think about. Many of us, if you are 40 years old, you lived through this period of time and probably heard many contradictory things about it. I know I did. And it was over before I was even out of middle school, for the most part. Even when there have been, Marxist states that have remained Marxist and either name or in principle. What we have not seen is new revolutions. Colonial revolutions, by and large, or anti-colonial revolutions, by and large, have not taken on the Marxist name since the 80s. Anyway, back to Gouldner's text. It happened within a normal span of a single lifetime. Heck, it happened within the normal span of a generation. It is a unique event, and we will all live in its midst, the historical epicenter of that political earthquake, whose tremors are felt throughout the world, was the Bolshevik assumption of power in Russia. Quote, the Bolshevik victory in November 1917 may fairly be described, wrote Moral Felsad, as one of the most remarkable triumphs of revolutionary engineering in human history. On the eve of the March Revolution, which first overthrew the Tsar, the total membership of the Bolshevik Party was generously estimated at 23,600 men. In the short space of 8 months, this small group was able to accumulate sufficient support to seize power in a nation of over 150 million. How did this happen? A small question for a great problem. Felsad notes that during World War I, the Tsarist government suffered ruinous losses of men, territory, resources, public recruit, and legitimacy. And these losses fostered a widespread desperation. The Bolsheviks alone, among the revolutionary parties, writes Felsad, were able to turn the resulting disorganization to their advantage. One major source of strength was the Bolshevik Party was a highly centralized organization, its activist membership, and the determination of its leader, Lenin. Back to Gouldner. This is substantially correct, yet something of consequence has been left out. In its unique role of special social theory of Marxism in forging the Bolshevik Party, in endowing it with a dense cohesion and shaping the party's tactics and strategies and giving it a sense of mission of making history. It's the role of this theory about which Felsad and indeed a majority of the school of interpreters of the October Revolution are silent, and I will return to them later. Certainly the men who fashioned the Bolshevik Party, who created it committee by committee, Congress by Congress, almost man by man, who painstakingly blueprinted it in his book of 1902, What is to be Done. Certainly the Lenin, who knew the Bolshevik Party like the Japanese gardener knows a tiny bonsai plant, whose every branch he has trained for 15 years, was not silent about theory, but he shouted its importance for the Bolsheviks. And that's important to consider too, although from our standpoint now, almost every Marxist, even the anti-Bolshevik ones, would admit it. Theory changing the world. Back to Gouldner. Lenin began in What is to be Done by quoting Marx's critique of the Goethe program. By the way, when people wonder how the Goethe program became so important, it's because Lenin used it in both What is to be Done and in State and Revolution extensively. And many of the Soviet conceptions of what communism is and its stages and everything else come solely from that text. Not from the manifesto, not from Capital's Volume 1, 2, and 3, not from Engels's Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, but from the marginal notes on the draft program of the Goethe Congress. In this, Marx had written to the German party leaders, if you must combine, then enter into agreements to satisfy the practical aims of the movements, but do not haggle over principles. Do not make concessions in theory. Then Lenin himself added, this was Marx's idea. This is a Lenin quote, by the way. And yet there are people among us who strive in his name to belittle the significance of theory. Without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. This cannot be insisted upon too strongly at a time when fashionable preaching of opportunism is combined with the absorption of the narrowest forms of practical activity. The importance of theory for the Russian Social Democrats is still greater. The role of the vanguard can be fulfilled only by the party that is guided by advanced theory. Lenin says it. So when Leninists talk about how theory isn't important and it's all practice, they are not listening to Lenin. That's me talking. But anyway, Gouldner goes on. Still further, Lenin quoted Friedrich Engels to the same effect. This is an Engels quote. It is the specified duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer understanding of the theoretical problems, to free themselves more and more from the influence of traditional phrases inherited from an old conception of the world, and constantly keep in mind that socialism, capitalized, having become a science, demands the same treatment as every other science. It must be studied. Lenin insisted, and I shall return to this at a later point, that a socialist conscience could only be brought to them, i.e., the workers, from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness. Ellipses. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the property classes, the intellectuals. The modern founders of scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. And that's much to the point. That's not contestable even. And in fact, you see this in Marx himself when he talks about proletarianization in the manifesto, which was all the way back in 1848, 1850, somewhere there. Yep, 1848. Just making sure I got that right. I can't remember if it came out during or right after the 1848 insurrections. The Bolshevik Party itself was at first largely conceived by an instrument through which the Theoretiki, who edited Lenin's newspaper Iskra, could imprint a proper socialist consciousness in the working class and on practical organizers. The party's centralized organizational character aimed in part to protect the theoretical germ plasma of its leaders, placing the party under control of the most theoretically informed, ensuring that their influence on those less theoretically trained, belittling the role of the conscious element, added Lenin, means, whether one likes it or not, the growth of the influence of bourgeois ideology amongst the workers. All those who talk about exaggerating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious element, etc., imagine a pure and simple labor movement can work out of an independent ideology for itself. If only the workers take their fate out of the hands of the leaders. Now, that's Gouldner quoting Lenin himself, and he's not quoting him out of context. Lenin's point, however, was that a serious revolutionary could not overestimate the importance of the theoretical. A man who is weak and vacillating on theoretical questions, who has narrowed an outlook, who makes excuses for his own slackness. Such a man is not a revolutionist, but a hopeless amateur. That's Lenin again. Thus, some historians now hold that the Bolshevik history was the result of the force of circumstances, not a Bolshevik commitment to a specific theory. The man who more than any other shaped these events tell us rather that theory was decisive in forging the Bolshevik organization, and without theory, there would surely have been no October Revolution. It is important to understand why historians minimize the role of Marxist theory. More generally, theirs was a reaction to the ideologically saturated view which regarded every development in the Russian Revolution as a logical outgrowth of some theoretical commitment. Thus, countless analyses of Stalinism have, for example, held it to be a straight line, fulfillment, and logical result of Marxism and Leninism. Given such a mechanical view, little attention need to be paid to history, to the events that actually unfolded, to what people really said and did, and to confusing circumstances which they found themselves. So, this is a kind of oblique comment on the anti-communist narrative of history that dominated in some schools up until the 1990s, but definitely dominated most schools in the West from the 1950s to the mid-1970s. And then there was a counterforce, which Gouldner is pointing out, which views all this theoretical stuff as not important, that most of this stuff is contingent on other events that became popular in sociological and more left history circles, I believe in the 60s and 70s. So that's a little context for those claims. Back to Gouldner. Given such a mechanical view, little attention needed to be paid to history, the ways events absolutely unfolded, to what people said and did, and to the confusing circumstances in which they found themselves. One merely has to invoke Marxist theory to account for everything. This model is a form of vulgar idealism. Yes, it is. In which history is simply an outgrowth of an idea. It is easy to understand, therefore, that it inhibited serious historical study and deserved to be opposed. So he's just talking about kind of a dialectical swap in the study of the Soviet Union by a lot of people who are maybe more slightly sympathetically oriented in the West in the 1970s, to correct from this whole, Stalinism is a coherent ideology and it's the reason why everything went bad and we can blame it all the way from moment one of Marx, etc., that was dominant actually from the 1950s into definitely until the 1970s and 80s in certain circles, but I think in pretty much all circles in the West in the 1950s and 60s, the first half of the 60s anyway. Anyway, back to Gouldner. Nonetheless, what has happened in the heat of the polemic against the vulgar idealism is some historians overstated their case and assigned no significance at all to Bolshevik theory and to Marxism. Here, vulgar idealism was supplanted by an eclecticism no less vulgar, by a tacit emphasis on the significance of human rationality. By a tacit emphasis on the insignificance of human rationality, by an overemphasis on the importance of the irrational in human affairs, and on the psychopathology of the leaders in making history. Does this all sound familiar to you? This is Varn talking again. I feel like I see this all the time. To this extent, however, historians failed in their special obligation to attend to the uniqueness of the events. For what was indeed unique about the Bolsheviks, and especially their leadership, was that they were theoretically dedicated men. Instead, they are, in some accounts, treated as if they were a recent end of ideology pragmatists concerned only with what works. Nothing could be further from the truth. I agree with this, by the way, for good and ill, too. Much more than most other political leaders, the Bolsheviks were defined and shaped by their intellectual commitments to a theory, to Marxism, and especially to Lenin's reading of Marxism. They and the things they did are incomprehensible without knowing this theory. This is not to say that the Bolsheviks were not influenced by other conditions, by the force of circumstances. That's in quotes. This is not to say that they did not sometimes change their theory, or sometimes act in gross violation of it. Still, the central consideration remains. The influence of the self-conscious articulated theory had on them was vastly greater than that which normally has on politics. That which it normally has on politics. And the events ramifying from their deeds will be opaque if the specific theory to which they were committed is ignored or depreciated. And to this I agree. It is much easier to define what Marxism is than what liberalism is, or fascism, or even feudalism. Or for that sake, capitalism. And Marxist-Leninism is easier to define than both, even though there's schools of Marxist-Leninism and Leninism in general. Marxist-Leninism has come since the 1970s in the West primarily to refer to people who were loyal to the anti-revisionist theories and fond of Stalin. But in general, Marxist-Leninism has been the official ideology of the Soviet Union and a major influence on the CPC's development. Anyway. The point is not that everything the Bolsheviks did was done because it was dedicated by their theory, or that the mirror image of their Marxist theory. Some of it was, for example, the great importance they attribute to the use of the state as an instrument for controlling the economy. In other cases, even where the theory's prescriptions were disregarded, the theory continued to have consequences in the same way that law has consequences, even where, as in crime, it is broken. To argue that because there are some differences between Bolshevik policies and Marxist theory, that therefore the policies are not influenced by the theory is like concluding that since law is broken, it is without consequence. It's an interesting analogy, Gouldner. I think I buy it. Anyway, let's continue. It is uniquely important to know Marxist theory if one wishes to understand the events that have ramified into the world from the time of the October Revolution. A knowledge of Marxist theory is an indispensable key to understanding the world-shaking revolutions of the 20th century, although it's certainly not a substitute for the study of history. Theory has become a social force when it finds an organizational instrument as historically remarkable as the Bolshevik parties, who utilized it as a lever to move great masses. And yet, if theory helps make history, it's totally impossible to understand that theory except as itself made historically, and by situating it in its proper historical context. And I shall shortly return to the point. Why study Marxism? For much the same reason we study genetics. Marxism is a genetic code, the germ plasma of the main 20th century revolutions and of societies that they created. Like any genetic influence, it interacts with its environment and is only part of what shapes outcomes, but it is a vital part, and without understanding it, we cannot understand many of the great events of the century. The two Marxisms as a project of critique. The project here, at one level, is a critique of Marxism which rests upon the assumptions of Marxism itself, and is thus, in part, an auto-critique of Marxism. This is ambitious. That's me talking. Indeed, the very idea of critique, originally rooted in Kant's critique of pure and practical reason, was transmitted and reshaped by Marx. In saying this, however, no ritual piety is intended, and it will soon be plain that I am not one of those who thinks a critique is something one inflicts upon others. Since the original idea of critique was never unambiguous, and since my own views of what counts is what counts here, I had best at once say what I mean by critique. 1. To understate. Marxism is something concerning which there are differences of opinion and strong feelings. Yeah, that is an understatement, Gouldner. It is certain that anyone interested enough in Marxism to read this work will find many things to go against his grain, and indeed I take it as axiomatic that any reader who works his way through this volume without at least some spasms of irritation is either a saint or has altogether wasted his time. Yet critique for me is in no way an effort to debunk or unmask a theoretical system. It is never undertaken as an occasion in which the critic outsmarts his subjects, and certainly never views the subject's work as a mere product of historical mistake or ignorance. Asterisk, and this is Varn talking again. This is why I find attempts to cut off critique of socialist parties, of left unity, of actually existing socialist states, of even Marxism itself, is to cut out how Marxism began. What did Marxism begin as? A critique of political economy on one hand, and a critique of utopian socialism on the other. The critique was not made to undermine socialism, but to move it past its impasse and, blueprints in the sky, basically. And while it was set to undermine capitalism, it wasn't supposed to do so just by saying everything in it was wrong. Capitalism has released many horrors upon the world, but it also fixed some, and we have to deal with that. And how we deal with that and how long we let that linger leaves a lot of questions, right? Anyway. It would seem, back to Gouldner, at least to those who do not hold mankind in contempt, that Marxism, which has won fully a third of the world today, could not have done so if it was bereft of all reason. ? Yeah. Although after 1992, that comes up a lot. And so a critique that searches for Marxism's rationality. At the same time, a critique seeing theory as a human product can have no impulse to canonize it. Conceiving theory as doing and making by persons caught up in some specific historical era, critique searches for the limits no less than the achievements of a theory. A critique is a lapidary act. It strives to discern and strike from Marxism, as from any doctrine, its flawed, erroneous, or irrational parts, so it may rescue its productive and rational side, polishing and resuscitating this in a new intellectual setting. 2. To critique a theory is a very active act, engaging the theory in dialogue. It is inevitably interweaves all commentary with exegesis, paying scrupulous attention to what the theorist's texts say, while at the same time recognizing the meaning of any text, and thus of any life, is never limited to the author's self-understanding. It must be interpreted, not merely recited. A theory contains a message, some part of which is surely the author's and known to him, but another part of it is only glimpsed and is opaque even to him. And it is therefore not rendered altogether intelligible simply by putting down his prefatory explanations of what his work is about. For all the prefaces, yes, all, are written only after the fact, are efforts to construct an account of what was already been done, which renders it consistent and acceptable, and therefore they are partly justifications, no less than explanations, partly distorting, no less than clarifying. An author's own account of himself, then, can never really be altogether taken to superior to someone else's account of him. As a side note, while I'm very careful about us taking plain readings of Marx or any text, I'm going to take this with Gouldner's too. I think it should be critical that we should never completely trust that an author understands all what they're saying. And then that is especially true in literary texts, but it's even true in theoretical ones. Sometimes there are implications, are contradictions, are adjustments that are not entirely clear to the author at the time. And I have always taken this attitude towards Marxist work. This is why I strive so hard to figure out what's actually being said, so I am not imposing something to fix a problem that may really be there, or placing a problem that I want to be there that isn't. To critique a theory, then, is to think about it not as a culturally privileged object, but as another object of culture. To be understood as we attempt to understand, say, a novel by William Gass, cinema by Kurosawa, a play by Pintner, and a layout and architecture in the Red Square in Moscow, a life such as Antonio Gramsci's, or an event such as Louis Napoleon's coup. Such a view of theory, it must be admitted, is somewhat at variance with theory's own exalted self-conception, which tends to present itself as if it were altogether transparent to itself and knowledgeable about what it is up to. The first commandment of all theorists' guild is, after all, to know what you are doing. Critique takes note of this special requirement, sees theories as bound by such a pledge, yet as no more capable of living a life without shadows than anyone else. To view Marx or Marxism as having shadows, silences, subtext beneath the text is no way to debase it, but only to see it as it's sharing in the common human condition. 3. A critique sees theory as embodying the unique talents of some intellectual craftsmen, the standards, traditions, and concerns of their craft, and also of larger society, culture, and historical epoch in which the craft is practiced. To see theory as a technical project, but never to see that alone. To view theory as a craft object is to see it as an object which is both in which both personality and history, individual and group, are blended into a focused statement. To view Marxism from the standpoint of critique is thus to see something more than the project of the lonely and tormented genius, or the works of warrior scholars, while at the same time recognizing that, since the life of a theory is concerned with transcending the commonplace, it is always a precarious performance. And I agree with Gouldner on this too. Whenever I talk about Marx, we also have to asterisk and talk about Marxism. What is Marxism after Marx? What is Marxism after Lenin? What is Marxism after Mao? What is Marxism after academic Marxism, both in the Soviet Union and in the West and in China later on? All these are open questions and evolving questions, which is why I often refer to Marxism as both an attempt at a science. Whether or not it's a coherent research program is still something I'm not totally sure of myself. I know it started as one. And something with its history, and thus like a tradition. Just like there's a tradition of biologists, which is not to say biology is not a science. And nobody referred to biological laws as a tradition of biology, but there is a tradition of biology in the way biology has been practiced and in its context in specific times. And thus, we need to take a similar point to any theory. However, with Marxism, you have a clearer set of delimitations than you do with something like biology. And this is what Stephen Jay Gould used to point out, that if Marxism was fully instantiated as a science, we wouldn't have to go back to capital all the time. We would not be engaged purely in hermeneutics because a living tradition of knowledge inquiry, to take a Lakatosian view of this, Lakatos, the Hungarian theorist of science, is about how coherent the terms can be used and what can be generated from that. Now, Marxism was never merely a research program either, and it is foolish to see it as such. It was a political program and a theory of history. Anyway, back to Gouldner. Although Marxists will be the first to agree that critique must view theory as a social and historical product, and thus something as more than the result of other and earlier theories, philosophies, or ideologies, they are not particularly eager to do this. Like normal academic sociologists, who are often made uneasy by the sociology of knowledge and downright distraught by the sociology of sociology, Marxists likewise do not hurry to their rendezvous with the Marxism of Marxism, which is in part why, as Perry Anderson writes, the history of Marxism is yet to be written. For Marxists, as for sociologists, the reflected efforts at historical self-understanding are often taken as narcissistic, diverting inquiry from its proper objective of understanding, not to speak of changing the world. That Marxism, like academic sociology, is indeed a historical and social product also discomforts those Marxists who think themselves social scientists. For if it is a historical product shaped by social needs no less than reason and research, it is in part the tissue of time rather than the eruption without precedent or achievement without peer. This perspective on Marxism, then, will not be congenial to those like Louis Althusser, who celebrate, quote, and this is from Althusser, Marx's discovery of the greatest event in history of human knowledge since the appearance of mathematics somewhere in Greece, or who shroud Marxism's origins in the mystique of an unaccountable compo epistemology, setting it altogether apart from and above from the other achievements of time. Critique, however, genuflects to no theory or theorist. If critique views Marxism as a product of need, no less than of reason, then it must go one step further in asking whose need. Certainly, Marxism never doubted that critique required an answer to that question. Moreover, any inquiry into social theory that lets matters rest simply by settling theory in its general historical context without relating it to some generative interest of some specific social group cannot be deemed a critique in any remotely Marxist sense. The matter then will in the end come down to a question that will be viewed either as outrageous or simple-minded. What is Marxism's class grounding? In short, what is its class origin? This question will be viewed as simple-minded by those Marxists who, reciting by rote the catechism that Marxism is the consciousness of the working class, think that this is all that needs saying, conveniently forgetting that Marxism also says consciousness is determined by social being. And if that is so, how can the proletarian consciousness of Marxism have been generated by the bourgeois social being of its authors? The question of Marxist class origins will, however, be viewed as outrageous by those Marxists who suspect that the answer to be given here is not the mechanical and contradictory answer some of them conveniently offer. 5. Although critique views theory as expressing and relying upon the needs and standards of the various groups from which it emerges, it does not assume that theory and theorists are related to this social context only harmoniously or in a dependent way. On the contrary, critique also sees theory work as commonly shaped by conflict with its environment and as proceeding in particular by opposing parts of it, elements of its technical tradition on one side and of common sense on the other. Like all other social theorists, social theories, Marxism emerges in an ambivalent relationship, both relying on and opposed to different parts of its technical tradition and to the culture of everyday life around it. Asterisk. I think this is very true. Unasterisk. Back to the Gouldner. Marxism establishes its identity only in drawing out a line between itself and such theoretical traditions as Hegel's philosophical idealism or English political economy, as well as elements of then common sense, such as religion or conventional political ideologies. More than most theories, Marxism emerged in the form of thrusting polemic against other views. Asterisk. This is very important. And it was often other views held by other socialists and, quote, leftists, and definitely by left liberals of the day. Marx argues as much with Proudhon as he does Adam Smith, and in some ways more. He argues as much with Louis Blanc as he does with the armchair socialists of the German historical school. Let us continue. Marxism emerged in the form of thrusting polemic against others' views, as indicated by the very titles of the work, The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, or Hegel's Philosophy of Law, depending on which translation you get. The Holy Family, a polemic against Bruno Bauer and others, the young Hegelians. The Critique of Political Economy, Anti-Doring, The Critique of the Goethe Program. To understand Marxism as any theory then requires an understanding not only of the actual intellectual allies and ancestors from which it draws its resources, but also of its intellectual adversaries. And with Marxism, this is Derek talking, it's even more important. And competitors from which it painstakingly sought to distinguish itself. Theory work is not done just by adding another brick in the wall of science, but it involves throwing bricks as well. It is not only involves paying one intellectual debts, but also, and rather differently, settling accounts. 6. If the idea of critique instantly focuses attention on the context of the text, i.e. its historical and technical origins, it also views the texts themselves as embodying their own internal contradictions, which it insistently seeks to identify and understand. But critique, as understood here, does not assume that only our adversaries are vulnerable to contradictions. It premises that even forces on which one is allied, we heroes, also have our own contradictions. And from this standpoint, then, Marxism will be seen as possessing its own contradictions, and contradictions will not be understood simply as a sigma of Marxism's enemies, as an asterisk. This is my annoyance with people who call everything that points out any particular problem in Marxism or its theoretical development as anti-Marxist. I have been in many groups that do this, and have many friends that still do this. I have always distrusted this impulse because it is self-flattering. One thing one should never do is premise such things on your own sense of self-worth and thus tendency to flatter yourself for knowing, for unveiling. Which is why, on my show, for example, you will hear critics of Marxism. It is why I try to engage with things like capitalist power or modern monetary theory, which are not Marxist, are only adjacent to Marxism, and in some cases outright hostile to it, as fairly as possible while having my own critiques of them. It is not because I want to destroy them or for them to destroy Marxism. It's that I want to understand the contradictions in each of these things, including my own commitment to Marxism. Are you willing to do that? Because most of the trend right now, even more than in the time Gouldner was writing, is to back away from that challenge, to back away from that auto-critique, to back away from that bravery, and to call that an instinct towards purity or an instrument of division or impracticality. It is not. For why do we keep making the same mistakes in the West? And why has the massive revolutions, which remember, only really ended in a period of 40 years ago, Why have they stopped? What happened? What changed? What did we fail to see? If you try to freeze that dialectical movement of ideas, of the way men make their own history, and let's expand the gender of that. I'm reading a text from the 80s, and I'm getting back into that headspace. The way people make their own history. History is not automatic. Anyway, to get back to the text. For some vulgar Marxists, to speak of Marxism's own contradictions is to depreciate and even slander it. It seems to say that Marxism shares something of a defective existence of the very life it wishes to abrogate. But who could deny that? A consistent autocritique of Marxism can do no other, and it must insist that Marxism, too, even Marxism and even socialism, has its own internal contradictions. There actually are books other than this one, I think, which do try to handle this and stay sympathetic to the Marxist and socialist tradition. And even within it, I think about the contradictions of actually existing socialism. There was a book I read, Monthly Review Press. Oh, who wrote it? So it's The Contradictions of Real Socialism, The Conductor and the Conductor by Michael A. Leibowitz. A book I actually suggest people read. Maybe I'll do something on it at a later date. I have it around here somewhere. Anyway, an attempt to hold these must deal with Marxism's living contradictions, not simply the vestal remnants of Marxism's birth, its bourgeois heritage, or Victorian prejudices. It must view Marxism's own contradiction as a living part of Marxism even today, and as essential key to its present condition and future prospect. Asterisk Varn talking. And that feels ominous today, doesn't it? Because Gouldner's writing this from a feeling of almost triumphantness. Marxism is spread around the world up into the mid-70s, although we could already see in the mid-70s that the Western powers were not as afraid of it anymore, and you can see that in their own policies. But from Gouldner's standpoint, things still looked hopeful. But it's funny how we crack and over-respond to even the smallest thing. Corbyn, Sanders, Syriza, Podemos. Important in their own context, but they didn't get far enough in many cases to fail, or if they did fail, they were disastrous, but for one country. The seeming stalling and failure at the end of the 20th century was much bigger than that. Epoch defining. In many ways, we are still very much dealing with its aftermath and are unable to fully break with the mentality of that time period, even though probably more than half of you do not livingly remember it. As I said, I barely do. The Cold War was over by the time I finished middle school. And I remember when I was in high school because the maps changed every few months. Yugoslavia was there and then it wasn't. Czechoslovakia was there and then it wasn't. There were 2 Germanys and there were 1. (6.1) To speak of Marxism's own contradiction is, I'm aware, to use a metaphor insofar as Marxism is more than a system of propositions. The truth of one of which implies the falsity of another. Yet Marxism is considerably more than a system of propositions or a doctrine. It is a larger organized community of actors pursuing a revolutionary project. Can actors' actions as well as propositions they utter also be contradictory? As a side note, I think this is an important question to ask. How do we square what people write with what we have evidence that they did? Usually most people rely on only one or the other, but never try to deal with the gap between the two. And that gap is where we learn the most about what these things are and what they can and cannot do. Do you see that? Do you understand? I hope you do. Does it help to look upon them in this way? Certainly it is legitimate to hold the propositions that may be contradictory to what a person's other actions are. To speak of actors' actions as contradictory is not, to be noted, a commitment to a general dialectic of nature, in which all nature is held to be potentially contradictory. My comments only embody a limited dialectic of social action, and not of nature, capital N. All human conduct may be regarded as embodying messages and meanings, some of which are reducible to propositional form, and some human conduct can be contradictory, even in strict construction of contradiction. Yet, to view social conduct as potentially contradictory or not is to view the persons as if they were logicians and rational, which they are, but only in part. Contradiction here, then, is indeed a metaphor. This is one of the more difficult things about the way Marxists and Hegelians use the word contradiction, because it's kind of different than like the strict Aristotelian propositional logic sense of the word, or like an axiomatic sense of the word, or the way contradictions work in math. It is in spirit related, but it is not quite the same. It is this, however, that is not different from other equivalent characterizations of actors and their conduct, such, for instance, speaking of there being tensions or strain or processing of dissonance. All these also entail metaphors. If contradiction likens social conduct to logic, tension seems to an organic, even medical metaphor, likening action to a body or a mind's exhaustion. Strain seems like a mechanical metaphor, likening social conduct to an overload, say on a bridge. Dissonance seems like musical or acoustical metaphor, likening some action to an intolerable sounds. Some such metaphors are inescapable and ought, if it seems to me, be judged largely by their consequences, by whether or not they make it possible to focus systemically on the implications of a consequence. All these metaphors, contradiction, strain, tension, dissonance, have an overlapping implication, commonly called attention to an increased probability of such things remaining as they were. If critique commits us to concern with contradiction, then it does because the project is a study of change and its mechanisms. As a side note, this is where I do actually take a Wittgensteinian view of language philosophy, contra someone like Lukács. Because many things that we think are concrete are metaphors, and sometimes we can't say concrete things without metaphors. And I love playing the game often when my engineer or physicist friends about when I'm using a metaphor and when they're not, because I'm often like, no, you're actually using a metaphor right now, so maybe we should drop the whole thing. And there are a lot of people, like their MMTers, like, aha, Marxism is part of the general classical tendency to view economics as physics, which of course was the hardest science because it's the smallest science. It is the science about the smallest particles and the things that are easiest to trace, even their hyper complex forms. And to some degree that's true, but that's true of everything. And attempts to draw economics to communities or sciences of community or any of that is also equally metaphorical. Maybe they're better metaphors, but they're still metaphors. Because any attempt to bracket out knowledge in a field as such is going to be metaphorical. In viewing Marxism either as a system of propositions or of actions that's potentially contradictory, my intent is not to render a judgment against Marxism's irrationality, but first of all, to insist that Marxists are themselves concerned with being and seeming to be rational, that the requirements of rationality are important to them no less than to us. I would love a definition of rationality here. That's the only thing I'm going to complain about in this. They will not simply be seen as billiard balls whose movements are produced by external forces, but as persons attempting to live in conformity with standards they deem proper, including those of rationality, and therefore they will exert themselves to pursue a course of conduct, partly because those courses are non-contradictory, and they will seek to escape contradiction or the appearance of it. In asserting my own interest in the contradictory character of Marxist ideas and actions, I am thus asserting my assumption that Marxists are in part actors committed to and capable of rationality, and who are in part shaped by their effort to be or to seem as such. 6.2. I'm going to go through these sub things here. To make a critique implies a concern with identifying what contradiction, strains, or dissonance embedded in Marxism, with a view seeming to concern other parts of the theory as efforts to reduce, control, or remove these, as well as concern with the resulting development of theory. One task of critique then is structural, to lay out and examine the elements opposing one another, and another part is dynamic, to explore the results of those oppositions. From the standpoint of critique, both the structure and dynamics of opposition are understood as achievements brought about by holding the theory, by maintained partly by their commitments and partly by the conditions which they lived. By the way, this is pretty much consistent with what Marx thought. That's me adding that. Back to Gouldner. One of the most general consequences of a contradiction in theory is to separate the mutually opposed elements, reducing their mutual interaction by splitting them off from the single system which they first exist, and segregating them from one another by incorporating each in different systems or subsystems that are, at least partly, insulated from one another. In other words, different subsystems may be elaborated through and result in a process of increasing differentiation of the initial system, so that each of the formerly contradictory elements is now enclosed in boundaries, reducing its interactions with the other. It will be my contention that the primary Marxism has a nuclear contradiction, that this generates and recurrently reproduces at least two boundaried subsystems of elaborated theory that I will call scientific Marxism and critical Marxism. I like this distinction better than like Hegelian Marxism and structural Marxism, or Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism, all of which those other antinomies are kind of just usually done by bracketing out most of the historical differences between the things being talked about in ways that make the vulgar binary hold a little better. But I think scientific and critical Marxism is actually somewhat fair because they're different projects. They seem similar, they're intimately related, they even overlap in the same people and some of the same text, but they're not exactly the same. Evolutionary biology is not the critique of divine command theory. It is the development of a positive theory that incorporated other positive theories from outside, including genetics itself. But there was a critique there too. But the scientific project is not so much Darwin's critical one as Darwin's positive one. Anyway, something to think about. And again, that's just an analogy, but it's one that might make this more clear. 6.3. Among other specific types of contradictions that are discernible in Marxism are those that will be called anomalies. These may be conceived as observations or assumptions that there are variants with the expectation derived from a prior theoretical commitment. Nothing then is inherently anomalous, but only in relation to some other theoretically grounded expectation. Asterisk. A lot of what I'm reading right now is to bring what Gouldner calls anomalies to light. What did Marxists think, and when did they think it, and what did they think it about? Often, and I find this in text all the time, people actually bracket out the time commitments and statements made by Marx, Engels, Lenin, etc., Trotsky, Mao, etc., so that they're not held accountable for those predictions not holding, such as in the transitional program predicting that capitalism's failure was imminent in the 1950s. It was oft repeated by both Marxist-Leninists and Leninists, aka Trotskyists. All right? I don't want anyone to bracket that stuff out. We are also going to remove the game that I also hate of saying, oh, that's not real Marxism or not real socialism, etc. Now, We can say that something doesn't mean the socialism as stated in this criteria, but its reality would mean that that criteria has a correspondence to something beyond itself. And I don't know that we can always say that. So I can say that, X is a Marxist, X is a socialist, but I don't agree with what they said, or I don't agree with the results, or I don't agree with how they did something. But I don't say they weren't doing socialism. They might have failed to produce a vision of socialism that even they articulated. And in most cases, actually, they did. But that's a different thing than saying they weren't doing real socialism. That's a no true Scotsman fallacy. While we do have to have definitions, just like I get tired of everyone saying every disagreement is anti-Marxism or anti-Marx, I also get tired of people pretending that the Marxists they don't like or think did bad things or have misunderstandings were not Marxist. I don't like it when people do it about liberals or conservatives either, but even conservatives don't tend to do that quite as much. They realize that their ideologies and the conceptions of those ideologies are contested. And it's precisely Marxism's weird insistence on a relatively rigorously spelled out ideology that makes it somewhat different. It is both an ideological critique and an ideology in and of itself. Anyway, back to Gouldner. It is not supposed that an observation automatically generates an anomaly, which, without interpretation, is taken to be a divergence from theoretical expectations. Whether or not an observation is anomalous is a definition produced by some interpretation. But any observation can be interpreted or defined as either conforming to or departing from a theoretical expectation. What does this belief predict? And if it doesn't predict anything, is it actually useful for anything? If it's not normative or predictive, is it even descriptive? Like we usually think of norms and descriptions as being separate, but norms and predictions and descriptions and predictions are not. Anyway. Even when from some third-party standpoint a given observation may seem anomalous, the theorist who made it may not see it that way. On the contrary, he often has a strong impulse to normalize the observation, i.e., to somehow define them as consistent with his expectations by accommodating observation to a theory or by denying the need for accommodation. For those of you listening to my series on Hal Draper, I think he's actually doing this in the Inevitability of Socialism essay, which starts out good, but I think ends in a muddle, as you will see as you get through our discussions of it. And this is why. Anyway, you get back to this. I shall return shortly to the problem of normalization, but for the moment, however, I simply want to stress that whether or not an observation is anomalous as a produced act, a definition made by interpretation rather than imposed or dictated by data itself. 6.4. There are at least two types of anomalies, research-generated and event-generated anomalies. Our study of Marxism will encounter. The first is the divergence from the expectation produced by deliberate efforts of scholarship. These research-generated anomalies are produced by scholars' own initiatives and technical interests. It would not have occurred but from some scholars' activities. The second, event-generated anomalies, seem to be produced by history, i.e. they are not contradictions with theoretical expectations generated by scholarly initiative. In short, they are not an academic problem arising from scholarly work, but a practical problem arising from outside, and that's in quotation marks, a theory. The first, research-generated anomaly, derives from reading or observation that may be only by some scholar. The second, event-generated anomaly, refers to newspaper-relevant events, hence visible even to a layman and to all those who read newspapers, or watch television, or listen to podcasts in today's day and age. That's me adding that. The event-generated anomaly derives from practical events visible to laymen, but to which do not become anomalies unless, additionally, viewed from the standpoint of some theoretical expectation from which they are defined as diverging. Among research-generated anomalies in Marxism that will be examined are Marx's observations of the role of the state in the course of studying the 18th Premier of Louis Bonaparte, and a few years later, his observation of Asiatic mode of production or Oriental despotism. The event-generated anomalies of most importance to Marxism will be discussed come in two ways. First, the observed failure of capitalism to self-destruct following the long depression of the last quarter of the 19th century. Asterisk. I really think this is important. I was going over for another reading that I was doing for my Patreon recently. Utopian, Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And in 1880, he says that all the contradictions needed to cause the anomalies to try to transcend themselves in the establishment of the business cycle and crisis of overproduction and in fairly advanced technology already existed and were ripe in 1880. In 1850, Marx predicted the beginning of the Long Depression would return the revolutions of 1848 and socialism would be imminent. In some ways, it is my belief from reading Marx's letters that the entire project of capital in some ways stems from this not happening. The culmination of the Long Depression is the Great Depression. What people like Heinrich Grossman predicted would be the end of capital. And until the war, things were going as predicted, but capitalism did not end. Then Trotsky and in the third period, the Soviet Union under Stalin both predicted that there would be a massive recession immediately after the war. But capital had reorganized itself during the war, and that recession did not come. What are we to make of that? As Hegel says, the hour of Minerva only flies at dawn, meaning we only realize things when they are almost over and something else is on the horizon. Just like we talked about neoliberalism as it seemed to be breaking, and we talked about Fordism as it seemed to end. Marxists in the 1960s were opposing Fordism and the system. You hear that? The system? They weren't referring to neoliberalism. They were referring to the Fordism that we now all have nostalgia about. Has that not hit you? And now we talk about neoliberalism more than more, but I'm not sure we're in a neoliberal epoch. Excuse me. All right. Let us continue. Secondly, the successes of revolution where it was the least expected in Russia, and the failure where it was the most expected in the industrial advanced Central and Western Europe, i.e., the industrially advanced Germany, but that was not in the was not as imperial as France and England, which were considered imperial and could stall off revolution by super profits, etc. We're almost done with the section, and that's with this thing tonight. The first event-generated anomaly contributed to Bernstein's revisionism. The second accelerated the decline of scientific Marxism and the rise of critical Marxism. What some people call cultural Marxism, which itself is a vaguely renamed Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, does have a little bit of kernel of truth in the shift from scientific socialism to critical socialism in the academy, which is when Marxism moves from parties into academia. But that period's also kind of over, but the two have remelded in an awkward way. Critique then centers on contradictions. First, contradictions between a theory and its foreign relations with other views, whether these are technical theories or assumptions about common sense, i.e. theories of everyday life. And secondly, critique focuses on contradictions internal to a theory, whether these are termed nuclear contradictions or termed anomalies, whether research-generated or event-generated. 6.5. Critique expects theorists will be far more ready to acknowledge and even accent contradictions between their own theoretical expectation and those of other theorists. Correspondingly, critique expects theorists to be far less ready to acknowledge the existence of internal contradictions within their own theory, or between their theory and their own research observations, or with event-generated information. And that last little bit is what I want us to deal with. I started a project with Esri XB 3 years ago called Mortal Science. Why did we call it Mortal Science? Because an immortal science of Marxism did not have the actual frailty of real science. Now, that project is largely ended, and we never actually defined enough terms to talk about what scientific Marxism really was and what critical Marxism really was. And I hadn't read this book yet. Now, I'm sure there's, and I'll tell you, there's large parts of this book I don't agree with, but its initial challenge is what I think we really need to be doing. That's why I talk about non-sectarianism, because I see sectarianism as an attempt to render the initial political and research impetus, the need to build a political and research program, a political program to change the world, and a research program to understand the world when it's changing and thus direct it, as crucial, indispensable, absolutely necessary. And yet I think that has been nearly impossible to do in the West since the 1940s, and maybe everywhere but China, Cuba, Vietnam, maybe the DPRK. I'm a little bit more hesitant on that one today. And even in those cases, things seem to have been stalled out and then radically changed or opened up. No longer cut away from the capitalist world, but integrated into it. Except in the extreme cases where the capitalist world will not let them even attempt, DPRK, to a lesser degree, Cuba. And I see a lot of people in the failure of Bernie to be willing to critique others in their movement, but not to look at themselves. What have they done? For us to say the left is dead and we help you to understand it is also to say that we have failed to bring a new left to life. And the question is why? And this is more than a theoretical question. This is also an event-generated question. This is both theory and praxis in the field of events. What can we do? Why do we think we can do them? And what do we think they will result in? And what do we do when our predictions are wrong? We can grace the lily of necessity as much as we want. Gild the lily of necessity as much as we want. It is both unnecessary and also dishonest, and makes our own theoretical work make no sense. It compounds contradictions and makes it harder to read what people directly actually believed at the time so we can understand what they meant. And if you don't believe me, I go through reading after reading, and some of this in the Patreon if you want to check it out, that does this. We can't do this if we actually want to succeed. Now, the left critiquing the left, if one only does that critique, if critique is all one does and it doesn't generate anything else, can become a very reactionary position. In fact, you're just defined in critiquing, and then eventually you move from critiquing to move forward to critiquing the just being against, and then falling into utter contempt. And the latter is dangerous. It is almost an inherently reactive position. No wonder so many people who do it eventually become reactionary. We do not know where Gouldner's politics would have gone. He dies after this book. But this book opens a lot of questions for us. Questions that aren't easy. And right now, a lot of people have taken hard questions and resulted to easy answers, be they moral or simple. That is not good enough. That has never been good enough. If we disagree with Gouldner, we have to rise to his challenge. And at some degree, we have to play the game with him. I will continue this in the future. I probably won't do as long of a section next time, but I will finish his criterion of critique as we go along. There's a new section coming up called The Lure of Normalization. We've gone through about 15 pages of his introduction. I will also link a reading on him that I might do in the Patreon, but I'll link it in the show notes here. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, comment if you enjoy this, share it with a friend. We'd be kind of, I'm not a monetized account. I don't need more views to get more money, but I want this to be available to the public. So I would like it to get views. And so if you would share, that's how I grow, either in podcast form or in this. If you really want to support me, the Patreon has tons of more material. You can get the audio only of almost anything I do on the YouTube page, with additional shows and additional commentary, etc. Sometimes there's 3 or 4 shows on the Patreon a week. So, you know, like, that's mostly the ones I produce here, but maybe 2 or 3 extra depending. Q&As, all sorts of stuff. All right, I'll end the self-plugging. It's always odd to have to self-plug. I'm going to add, tells you the weird nature of what we do. And with that, good day.